Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue our reading of A Prophet in Babylon with Chapter 6, Part B. 8:30 struck, the deacons arrived and were soon seated at the table. Small and Hawking were the first to come. 3 others followed, one of whom only is important in this story. A little nervous man called Tasker. The last to arrive was Palmer. Robert surveyed the little party with an eye of a strategist. He could rely on Hawking and Small. With the former of them he had had a long private conference that morning, the issue of which was the general agreement of hostility against Grant. Small was an obstinate and awkward man who usually kept his own counsel, but Roberts knew him to be highly incensed over the sermon of Sunday. Tasker was an amiable man who suffered from constitutional inability to make up his mind on any subject whatever. He was never so happy as in balancing probabilities, discovering difficulties, quibbling over non-essentials. His favorite phrase was that things act and react. Everything acted and reacted, every road had its lion in the path, every course of action led to negations. Therefore, inaction was the only real wisdom. He was not sure whether his politics were Republican or Democrat. Sometimes they were one, sometimes the other. He would argue for the new theology, but always with a saving clause that a good deal might be said for the old. Sometimes he talked like a socialist, but the moment he was acclaimed as one, he repudiated the accusation and became violently individualistic. You see, everything acted and reacted. He had used that phrase for so long that he had come to believe it, the statement of an ultimate philosophic principle. It was a perplexing world for poor Tasker, a world singularly destitute of plain paths and wickedly labyrinthine in its system. What could an amiable and resolute man do in a world where everything had its mischievous habit of acting and reacting? The conversation was at first desultory. The fact was, no one cared to come to the point. At last Roberts forced the pace. "It's 9 o'clock, he remarked. "Don't you think we had better come to business?" "Perhaps Brother Roberts will state the business," said Hawking, with a knowing glance. "I've no problem," said Roberts, with a stiffening of his prim figure. He adjusted his spectacles and began with his most lawyer-like tones of precision, his thin, quiverous voice giving a disagreeable emphasis to each word. At first he confined himself to his old theme of facts and figures. His fellow deacons moved uneasily. They had heard it all before. They also knew that this part of his speech was mere skirmishing. They were impatient for the main point of attack. "Well then, it comes to this," he concluded. "We can't pay our way on the present basis. This is a meeting of businessmen, and we must look at things in a business spirit. We all respect and admire our pastor." Here Hawking coughed loudly, and Tasker nodded approvingly. "But when a business is not succeeding, however much we may respect our manager, we have to deal with him plainly. We have to tell him that part of the blame is his. In any case, it would be only just to reduce his income. I am prepared to recommend the latter course of action in regard to our manager, our minister, viz. That the circumstances of the case warrant us in reducing his income by 1/3. The conclave drew a long breath. Tasker was the first to speak. He was taken by surprise. Of course, he would not dispute the figures, but there was a point that weighed with him. What would the world think? What would become of their prestige? Re-entrenchment might be necessary, but was it politic? And then came his favorite phrase, these things acted and reacted. On the one hand, you might retrench, but on the other you might consider what the effect would be on the public. There was clearly no light of resolution in Tasker. "Prestige," growled Small. "I guess that's pretty low anyway. Last Sunday has given the church a black eye for all decent people." "Allow me," replied Tasker with his most amicable voice. "But I really don't think I can let that pass. I don't think I can. I don't at all agree that the church has suffered it by anything from what has occurred. In fact, if we are to discuss the last Sunday morning address, I must say I agreed with it. That is in part. I think that if we came to talk matters over with the pastor, we would find that we all agreed with him in part. Of course, he may have been injudicious, slightly injudicious, but the papers were not unfriendly. I have all the press reports in my pocket. I think I can prove that the press was not unfriendly, that is, not really unfriendly. We are not here to discuss the press, interrupted Hawking. We have our own eyes. We can read. Yes, replied Tasker, but isn't it a fact that this meeting was called as a result of last Sunday's sermon? No, it's not a fact, said Roberts. We may have our own views about that sermon, but for my part, I thought it was deplorable. But whether that sermon had been preached or not, we should still have to consider the financial position of the church. That is the main point. That is what we are here to discuss. The two colorless deacons nodded their heads. They were old gentlemen and wanted to go home to bed. They were amiable men with no known antipathies, but they each cherished a long dislike of late meetings. In the meantime, Palmer sat silent. He had been coldly greeted on his arrival by Roberts, who had secretly hoped that he would not come. I agree with Deacon Roberts, he said. As to the real point of discussion, no one is better able than he to discuss finance. No one is less fitted to discuss ethics or philosophy. Palmer's voice was quietly ironical. It was that note of irony in Palmer which always irritated Roberts. It was a weapon against which he knew he had no defense. He flushed at the words, and his eyes flashed behind his spectacles. But he mastered himself and said with a sorry attempt at a smile, That is not prettily put, but I don't dispute its truth. I am glad that Deacon Palmer supports my view of the nature of the meeting. Nevertheless, said Palmer, ethics do enter into this discussion, as they do into any kind of human business. I think we should be very sure that in any attitude we may take tonight toward the church and its affairs, no personal feeling is allowed to distort our views. I disclaim all personal feeling, reported Roberts. I am concerned solely over the finances of the church. I don't allow any feelings connected with the pastor to enter into the matter. Judas would probably have said the same thing, said Palmer. He thought so much of the 30 pieces of silver that he quite forgot his master. What am I to understand by that? Said Roberts angrily. Precisely what I said, said Palmer. Your mind is obsessed by questions of finance. I don't say that they have no importance, but you see nothing else. There is much more than a pitiable question of money involved. There is a human life, a man, a ministry. There is the question of truth, what men ought to think and do who call themselves the disciples of Jesus, how they ought to feel. What is the right interpretation of their discipleship? Judas forgot all that. He saw failure ahead, and his own prestige threatened, so he made the best bargain he could and got 30 pieces of silver. And in his shameful fear and haste had not one thought of love or loyalty or even pity for the man he had professed to follow. We are in peril of the same blindness tonight. We are thinking of money, always money, and... I must interrupt this diatribe, said Roberts. As chairman of this meeting, I must interrupt. His thin voice quavered with indignation. I must insist that the question which is before us be discussed, he continued. Which is? Asked Palmer. A recommendation which I make after long deliberation that the salary of the minister of Mayfield Avenue Church be reduced by 1/3. After long deliberation, said Palmer. Should I be wrong if I guess that the deliberation was no longer than since last Sunday? That in fact this step is the direct result of certain feelings aroused on that day? Now, need we recriminate like this? Said Tasker. According to my view, you're both right and I'm both wrong. Of course the question is of finance, and it must be considered, and I suppose that certain things said last Sunday will have some influence on the minds in considering it. These things act and react. But no one heeded him. The little man flushed with nervousness and sat down in painful agitation. Roberts and Palmer remained standing. It was evident that the duel was between them. I don't know what right anyone has to investigate my private thoughts, said Roberts, but I don't in the least object to giving a plain answer to a plain question. I did resolve on my course last Sunday. I did so because I saw that from that hour new difficulties were certain to come upon the church. Things were difficult before that. They are 1,000-fold worse now. Therefore, I am now of the opinion that the course I recommended has now become imperative. We must reduce our expenditures, and do it at once. Has Deacon Palmer anything to say against that course? Yes, that's the point, said Hawking. Let us vote and be done with it. Small nodded his head vehemently. The two colorless deacons nodded theirs. They were eager for bed, poor gentlemen, and did not care very much what happened, if only the meeting would close. Yes, I have something to say, said Palmer. An amendment, perhaps? Sneered Roberts. Not altogether, said Palmer. A statement, rather, and one that may prove a little surprising. Briefly, it is this. I have had a long conversation today with Dr. Gaunt. The issue of it, as regards this particular discussion, may be stated in a few words. Dr. Gaunt recognizes fully the financial difficulties of the Church, and takes what I think is a more than generous view of his own responsibility for those difficulties. He is also entirely aware that since he does not intend to retract anything that he said last Sunday, but rather to reiterate it, the difficulties of the position may tend to increase rather than decrease. Therefore, he authorized me to say that henceforth he will accept no fixed salary from the Church. He wishes to be entirely free in his teachings, and in order to become so, has determined to free the Church from all financial obligations towards himself. The announcement came as a bolt out of the blue. Roberts knew that his scheme had failed. He was too astute to admit it, however. He uttered a few halting words which expressed a recognition of the generosity of Gaunt. But no one was deceived by them. Least of all was he himself deceived. From that hour his enmity was hatred, the unquenchable hatred of defeated cunning. And that's the end of Chapter 6, Part B. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 7. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.